One of the things that's interesting about language is that while it's basic to us, it's arbitrary. The signs that are used in language can be defined in any number of different ways. This means that over time, groups have developed distinctive ways of using these signs, which have come to be mutually unintelligible languages. When we say that to be human is to have language, therefore, we should also note that to be human is to have a specific language. There's no such thing as language generally, just individual languages that people speak. Now, the variation among these languages takes a number of different forms. One simple and obvious way is vocabularies, the words that you use for different things. Now, the great example of this used to be the Berlitz guides, these little pocket dictionaries that people would take with them when they traveled. I'm not sure people even still use them. They would contain a bunch of different phrases in your language, and then the equivalent word or phrase in the language that you were going to. Like, if you were going to Spain and you needed to ask someone where the bathroom was, you would look up the English word bathroom, and there next to it would be the word baño. And so you could go up to someone and say, baño, and they tell you where to go. Now, that's something we're used to, right? Every language has its own vocabulary, its own set of words that refer to different things. And that sounds like a pretty simple concept. But it's important to recognize that differences in vocabulary are more than just differences in the concepts that those names are referring to. It's not as if the natural world contains a group of objects and the languages just assign names to them. Rather, the world is essentially undifferentiated, and language divides it up into things. Take the concept of idiots, for example. In your standard English, and if you're a speaker of standard English and someone does something really dumb, you may call them an idiot. Maybe you call them a fool. Maybe you call them a stupid hit. They all mean about the same thing. The Yiddish language, by contrast, offers a rich set of names: schmuck, putz, schlemiel, and many others that have been applied to me over the years, mainly by my in-laws, at various times. Now, they don't mean the same thing. Schmuck is a word you'd use for someone who you're really mad at, a real jerk who'd done something really bad. While schlemiel is someone who's an idiot, but they can't help it. They've always been an idiot, and they're always going to be an idiot, and you can't really be blamed for it. Yiddish differentiates a lot of different degrees and types of idiot, and that's why they have all these words. In English, we just don't have that many concepts for it. Now, you surely know some things like this if you are fluent in another language, concepts that just don't carry over easily into English. The point is that vocabularies aren't just a bunch of different words. They're a bunch of different worlds, divisions of reality that to a certain extent make the world feel like a different thing for people in different linguistic groups. Let's take another example, distance. What concepts do we use to say how far away something is? Well, one way we can do that is through what we call spatial distance, right? Distance in space. How many miles or kilometers is it from one place to another? So the different distance from where I am in Plattsburgh to downtown Montreal is about 65 miles. That's one way we can talk about it. Another way we could do that is through temporal distance, right? How long does it take to get from one place to another? So Plattsburgh is about an hour's drive from Montreal, right? Now, temporal distance isn't exactly the same thing as spatial distance. After all, the time that it takes depends on how you're getting there and what's in between you and it. You know this if you've ever looked for apartments in the Plattsburgh area, or you look on Craigslist and every single ad will say that the place is 5 minutes from campus, right? But there is a big difference between something on Margaret Street, which is a 5-minute walk, and some farmhouse west of town, which may be a 5-minute drive at 60 miles an hour. Temporal distance, it matters how you're getting there. It is also a lot more dependent on things like the time of day, right? It may take an hour to drive to Montreal from here in the mid-morning on a weekday because you're not likely to spend more than a few minutes at the border crossing. If you go on a weekend, though, during the summer tourist season, it's going to take you an awful lot longer. It may take you 2 hours to get to Montreal. It even depends on who you are. If you're a resident of New York or Quebec, they aren't going to ask you too many questions at the border, and your time at the border crossing might be pretty quick. It might delay you 5 minutes. If you're from a state far away, though, or if you're from another country, they're going to have some questions about what you're doing there, Why are you making the crossing right here? Why aren't you back home? They may have some suspicions about you, and that is going to delay your crossing. So if we talk about things in terms of temporal distance, we're talking about them in a way that is much more fluid than if we talk about them in terms of spatial distance. When you talk about spatial distance, it's always the same. It doesn't matter who's talking or when it is. Temporal distance matters a lot more. Now, this means that if your culture talks about distance in spatial terms, you're going to tend to think of it differently than if you talk about it in temporal terms. Space will be for you a more stable and reliable and predictable thing. Now, in our language, of course, we use both of these. But there are still other ways that we could use and we don't. For example, in many small cultures, they use a terminology which we sometimes call social distance. Suppose I have two neighbors. One of these neighbors is Ned Flanders, the nicest man on earth, a man who will allow Homer Simpson to borrow his tools for years without ever asking for them back, right? That's one side. My other neighbor on the other side is Houston Texans defensive end J.J. Watt, who isn't nice at all. I've seen him on Sunday in football games. He routinely charges out onto a football field and attempts, with some success, to remove body parts from players on the other team. And they pay him for this, right? Now, let us further suppose that I'm not on such great terms with Mr. Watt. The other day, I accidentally ran over his dog. And then he caught me stealing cucumbers from his vegetable garden. And then he noticed me spray painting the words "Texans suck" on his lawn. As I say, he plays for the Texans. And after that, he yelled at me. And he told me that if he ever sees me again, he's going to pretend that I'm the quarterback for the New York Giants, right? Okay. Now, how far away are each of these homes from me? Each of them may be identical in terms of spatial distance, say 50 feet. It may take me exactly the same amount of time, about 30 seconds, to walk to each of those houses. It won't feel the same, though. The road to Ned's house will be quick and happy and painless, and I'm likely to go there every day. The road to JJ's house will be a grim, terrifying death march that's going to feel about 300 years long. In other words, distance isn't just a matter of how far or how much time is involved in a journey, but also what kind of reception you expect to get when you arrive. Now, in some cultures, this is the primary way they talk about distance. Someone's far away if you don't get along with them, nearby if you do get along with them. Their terms for far and near they include the dimension of social distance. Now, we don't have these kinds of words for distance, so we don't tend to think of distance that way. We're not in the habit of connecting the idea of spatial and temporal distance with our social relationships, which means that for us, distance has a palpably different meaning than it does for them. Our language, the terms we use to talk about this, shape the way that we think about it. Now, this idea that different languages involve different experiences of reality is associated in anthropology with something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf were two early linguistic anthropologists who argued that language shapes reality so much that to speak another language was really to live in a different world, and that accordingly there is no way to understand another person if you don't speak his or her language. Now, that's probably putting things a little strongly. There's a lot we can understand about other people, even if we don't share their language. But still, it's a basic idea of cultural anthropology that language is critical to understanding how people experience the world. And one of the first things we do when we study another culture is to try to learn the language. Now, of course, vocabularies aren't the only way that languages can differ from one another. Grammar can be very different from one language to another as well, as you know if you've studied language. French, for example, uses a lot more tenses than English does. Russian has a lot more inflections of nouns. In Latin, you can put the words in almost any order you like without changing the meaning, right? Now, some of these structures can be very subtle, and they can be very difficult for someone from another language to even perceive, much less master. That can add a dimension of difference that only very good linguists can be aware of. Even though there are a lot of very important differences in vocabularies and grammatical structures among languages, There is reason to think that there are some similarities as well, that there are some deep grammatical structures that are consistent across all human languages. This idea is most strongly associated with a linguist named Noam Chomsky, who has pointed out a number of deep structures that you find in all languages. Reflexive pronouns, for example. I'm not going to go into details on this, but there are some similarities in the way that all languages create pronouns that refer back to the speaker. Words like myself, yourself, himself, and so on. It seems likely that these similarities occur for practical reasons, that there's a way of doing reflexive pronouns that makes language easier to understand. Now that makes sense, and it doesn't sound like a big deal, but it is a big deal. And this is why. It means that language is not entirely arbitrary. While it can take a lot of different forms, while it can vary a whole lot, that variation isn't limitless. Language is, at its base, a tool, a means of communication, and like any tool, there are requirements that it has to meet. There are 1,000 different ways to make a hammer, but all of them, at some level, have to be able to pound in a nail. You can't make a working hammer out of tapioca pudding or sand, right? Likewise, there are a zillion different forms that language can take, but there are some basic principles and functions that all of them have to address. Now, another example of this is language acquisition, right? How people learn language. People speak different languages all over the world, but there are clear similarities in the way that children learn them. Regardless of what language they're speaking, for example, children tend to get two-word sentences at about 18 months. And if you listen to the way children talk, they use a consistent grammatical order that is simplified from and related to their parents' language in a very predictable way, a way that's going to be similar no matter what language around the world you're speaking. This is also true for the formation of new languages, things like pidgins and creoles. A pidgin language is a common language that's worked out by groups of people who are brought together by circumstances who don't speak a common original language. This is very commonly associated, for example, with enslaved people in New World plantations, or in plantation workers in colonies, people who may have been brought up speaking a bunch of different unrelated languages, but who are thrown together and have to work out a common way of speaking. Pidgin languages tend to have a common structure. For example, they don't tend to have prepositions or auxiliary verbs. They don't have to or the and so on. Nor do they tend to have inflected pronouns. So instead of saying, I will go to the house, a pidgin language is likely to say something like, me go house. Now, people often make fun of this kind of speech, and in movies like George of the Jungle, it's often used as a shorthand for mental defectiveness. People who speak like this are seen as simple or stupid or primitive and so on. But pidgins are actually used by perfectly intelligent people as a stripped-down, workable means of communication in a very difficult situation. Remember, all of the people speaking these languages also speak another language, their original language, that is as complex as any other language in the world. Now, over time, as pidgin speakers become a cohesive culture, these languages can acquire more sophisticated grammatical features and develop into something called a creole. A creole is a fully developed language that is derived from multiple sources. Creoles around the world tend, like pidgins, to have some similarities among them, right? For example, they tend to use intonation instead of word order to make a question. In English, for example, if you want to ask a question, you might invert the first few words, right? Take a statement, you will come with me. If you want to turn that into a question, you reverse the first two words. Will you come with me? In a Creole version of the language, instead of rearranging the word order, you would use a rising tone. You'd say, you will come with me? And that's how you'd ask the question. Creoles are also more likely, for example, to use double negatives, right? Do you want coffee? I don't want no coffee, instead of I don't want any coffee. Very common in Creole languages. The fact that these things form in such regular ways when languages come together suggests that these may reflect basic features of language, something essential about how human communication works. This is very common in anthropology, that when we look at atypical cases that emerge out of stress or cultural disruption, we can get a look at some of the basic mental processes that underlie human culture.